somewhat unique, being the only survivor in Chaffey County.
Yeah.
And he wanted to get me in here before I pass on next year. I'm 98 years old in 2 months.
Yeah.
In your program, you're opening up to the middle page, a picture of me, but more than that, there is an error. It says I was assigned 4th Command there, which I was, on Henderson Field. It was Hickam Field, and it was next to us. I was not on the field, not in the Air Force Corps. The picture below it of a crashed Japanese Zero, I witnessed that plane come down. Killed 4 men in my outfit. And whether the pilot was kind of kamikazing and the engine was still running, whether he was hurt or what happened, we don't know. But that was the first plane shot down that we know of. When I was asked to speak, I thought it would probably be about Pearl Harbor, but you all know what happened that day. So I'd like to just kind of ramble around about little incidental things that you may not have thought of that went on during that period. And 2 things. One, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. And if you get tired of me listening, tell me and I'll cut it off. I went in the Army at the age of 19. I was kind of an impulsive young man, and I think I joined the Army because I could. There was no real reason for it, but at that time, war was going on in Europe, and the Japanese had been at war since 1937. We were starting to build up our forces, but the country in general was against the war effort. So we did help the Europeans, the British somewhat, but we didn't get involved directly. When I went in the Army, they were building up the forces that were out overseas at that time. Overseas meant Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska, Puerto Rico. And they were all offshore defense units. I went in the Army from Brooklyn, New York, processed through Fort Slocum with the usual shots, lots of shots, and uniforms and physicals. And a short time later, I was on a transport, the Army transport Leonard Wood, heading for Honolulu. We stopped in South Carolina at Fort Moultrie, stopped on both sides of the Panama Canal, stopped in San Francisco at Fort McDowell, and went out to Honolulu. 28 days it took to get there. They didn't fly you around in those days. To a young kid from Brooklyn, Hawaii was a foreign country. It was still not a state, but white people were in the minority. The ethnic groups were Hawaiians, Samoans, Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, Koreans, Chinese, Japanese. Japanese were probably the largest ethnic group in the islands at that time. Duty there was good, weather was great. We did our basic training right there in the Coast Artillery. And I learned later, which was something good for me, I didn't know when I joined the Army. I had my choice of places and which kind of an outfit I wanted. I knew I didn't want the infantry, so I chose Coast Artillery. Well, that turned to be a pretty good deal because they're not an offensive unit, they're a defensive unit. Our job was defending Pearl Harbor and the ships, and I stayed there for all my time, well, all my overseas time, 3.5 years. Duty was good, regular Army, this is all regular Army, there was no draft yet at that time. And let me get out some notes so I can remember what I wanted to say. People often say when I said I was in Pearl Harbor, the first question is, what ship were you on? I wasn't, I was Army. There were 44,000 Army troops on that island at that time. It's the most heavily fortified place in the world. The Coast Artillery, which guarded the harbors in the Navy, was numerous. There was Fort Ruger, Fort DeRussy, Fort Kamehameha, Fort Weaver, Fort Barrett, on an island that's only 100 miles around. And then up in the middle of the island at Schofield Barracks was 2 and 3 divisions of infantry, ground forces. It was truly the paradise of the Pacific. It wasn't as crowded as, I don't know how many have been to Hawaii, but it's very touristy now. In those days, there were only 2 hotels down on Waikiki Beach. There was a cruise ship come in once a week, and that was almost like a holiday. When it was boat day, all the locals got down and with leis and music and welcomed them there. And some of the wealthy people had homes over there for vacations. In the Army at that time, we used to have alerts. Middle of the night, a siren would go off, and we'd fall out and report. They'd report into higher headquarters how long it took to assemble the troops, and then we'd go back to bed. One night we got up and got out there for an alert. We went through the talking and reporting, and we moved out. And supposedly we were going on maneuvers, but they issued us things we didn't have in peacetime. We didn't have helmets, tin hats. We got helmets. We got gas masks. We got sandbags to fill up, put around machine guns and things. It acted like a war footing, and there was live ammunition. Now, when you're a private in the Army, I was a private at that time, you don't know what you're doing, why, you just know you do what you're told. Nobody comes down and says, now this is what's happening, fellas, and we want you to think about this. The officers know, but they keep it to themselves. The rumor was that the Jap fleet had moved and our intelligence people had lost track of it. So we went on a war footing. So even at that time, that was about 1941, well, early in 41, our military was aware that there was a possible problem with the Japanese, and they were getting ready for it. Later on, one of the problems we were getting into, the military intelligence people decided there were so many Japanese in Hawaii that they'd be a people for sabotage. And so they're very concerned about the Japanese on the island. Some of them, of course, were American born, but a lot of all these different races were brought there for the sugarcane fields, for labor originally. And we went on anti-sabotage alerts. We put sentries on everything. Any place there was anything valuable, like our guns or ammunition depots or airplanes, they had guards on them. We were out that way for weeks. Finally, they called it off. We don't know why. There had been no sabotage acts, but that's the mentality of our superiors. Well, they lined up all the airplanes so they could guard them better. And of course, the ships were all together in the harbor. And the next day when the attack took place, it was like shooting peas in a pod. Let me tell you something that probably you don't realize. You know what happened, but the task force that brought those planes up, the Japanese planes up, were 6 carriers. We only had about 3 carriers in our whole Navy. They had 6 in that one task force. 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 11 destroyers, 3 submarines, 25 other subs spaced along their route, so that if another ship showed up, they would sink it so they wouldn't report this convoy coming in. And 8 supply ships, most of which I think they weren't troop ships, they were probably tankers, because the Japs had several thousand miles to go and they had to refuel at sea, and some of the tankers turned back as they emptied. They carried aviation fuel and diesel fuel. One little thing that happened during the attack that I remember, my first sergeant was married to a Japanese girl, had 2 children, lived on the base, he was a career soldier. Before he reported to the alert, came in later and he said, He's put his wife in the car and the two kids and said, "Get the hell out of here." We were under attack. Well, they had to drive across Hickam Field, and I often wondered, she was Japanese. During that attack, a civilian Japanese driving across a military base was in a risky place. But she had family in town in Honolulu. I will tell you, I don't know if you ever heard the figures of the casualties. I mean, I won't go into detail on the battle itself. The Navy lost 2,008 men, the Marines 109, the Army 218, and 68 civilians were killed. Wounded, 710 Navy, 69 Marines, 364 Army, 35 civilians, for a total of 3,581 casualties. That was done in 2 hours. The thing that was bad, they did not attack all the facilities. They went after airplanes and ships. Army aircraft, we lost 4 B-17s, all on the ground. Well, most of them were on the ground. 12 B-18s, 2 A-20s, 32 P-40s, 20 P-36s, 2 OA-9s, and 1 O-49 for 73 aircraft put out of commission. We didn't have many aircraft. You got to remember, this was during the Great Depression. The Army's budget had been cut. Most of our equipment was World War I vintage, and we didn't have many of them. Ships, we lost 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers for 14. Navy aircraft, they lost 13 fighters, 21 scout bombers, and 46 patrol bombers for a total of, and 6 miscellaneous for a total of 86. That was probably 3/4 of our whole Air Force at that time. However, the Japanese lost 6 fighters and 14 dive bombers. Considering we were at peace and not ready for this sort of thing, didn't have everything set up to fight a battle, that's quite a number. They lost 24 total. They also lost a submarine and 5 midget submarines. I don't know if those kind of figures have ever shown to you before. I know my dad said later on that when they got the report of Pearl Harbor, and he knew I was there, of course, they did not know all the damage that was done until a year later when they reviewed it. They started telling the civilians, the people back home, about how many battleships we lost. During the attack, I was in an 8-inch gun battery, but they were railway. And we had several spurs around the island where we could be moved to take care of that side of the island. We were ordered to move to the west side of the harbor because if the Japs were following up with landing craft, they'd be coming from the west, probably. There was a place called Brown's Camp, was not much of a facility, but it was Army owned and we had spurs for the trains in there. However, the tracks go through Hickam Field and Hickam Field was bombed and the tracks were knocked out. Also, we lost power. The siren, when it was sounding the alert turned, quit in the middle of the time. Anyway, during the night, they got in there and repaired the tracks, and a couple of little engines from Wahoo Rail and Land Company came in there and hooked onto our guns. They could hardly move them. They were so heavy compared to what they were used to. It was narrow gauge. Our guns weren't. Well, we towed us out to Brown's Camp, where we prepared for an invasion. That was the whole thinking by that time. They'd be invading, follow up with an invasion. Well, we had no facilities there, so for a month, we dug emplacements, strung miles and miles of barbed wire. And barbed wire isn't a fence like you see here around a ranch. It's 8 foot wide, the way they string the stuff so that you can't just, and it's strung loosely, so it catches on people's clothes if they try to crawl through it. But we did that day and night. We worked all day. Oh, we went on the alert every morning at 4 a.m. so that at daybreak we were on our gun positions in case the attack did come. And lots of guard duty at night because this anti-sabotage mentality was still in vogue. The trouble with the camp was that it was a camp in name only. We had no running water. We had no bathroom facilities. We had nothing there except us. And with all that laborious work in the hot weather, I think we didn't get showers for a month. Pretty raunchy, I think. Because we didn't have hot water and everything, everybody quit shaving, and that caused a furor because a chemical warfare officer came around and pointed out you can't wear a gas mask if you've got a beard. It doesn't seal. So we all had to shave with whatever we had. Miles of barbed wire. I was, at the time, I had been a Morse code radio operator. Shortly after the war started, we suddenly got brand new radios, and they were voice controlled, so they didn't need a Morse code operator anymore. But before that, I was manning the radio, and it was old-fashioned radio, pretty low frequency. I could pick up the broadcast band out of Honolulu, and the things you heard were interesting. The first thing that was going on, all civilians, all officers and enlisted men's families, all Americans, people who didn't belong there, had to be taken out of the island in case of an invasion. They were commandeering ships at sea, bringing them in there, loading them up with wives and families, children, sending them out of there. Then you'd hear an announcement like, all doctors and nurses report to the nearest hospital. I know I read one place where a Navy dispensary in Pearl had over 300 casualties the first day, the first few minutes, mostly burns from the oil burning. They were overwhelmed. They couldn't possibly handle it. In Triplet General, which is the big hospital for the whole Pacific in the Army, they too were more than they could handle. So they brought in civilian doctors, civilian nurses, and smaller hospitals. Then we heard all kinds of things like, if there's a shortage of some kind of a food or baby food or something, you could work around it, and they try to get some for people. It was kind of a mess, but it was working out. The other thing I forgot to mention, the governor stepped aside and the Army took over under martial law. That's an interesting way to live. The general became the governor, and all the courts were manned by Army officers. And you began to hear things like somebody got arrested. Everybody was supposed to be going with the war effort. You'd hear on the radio that somebody had been arrested for being drunk on the street. The MPs picked them up. The judge would fine them 3 pints of blood or 5 to 10 war bonds. And if you don't have a job, we'll put you to work. There was it's an absolute dictatorship. Oh, because we got the voice radios, they didn't need Morse code operators anymore, and there were 3 of us. Well, there was 4. The sergeant in charge of the group was in the command post as communications sergeant. They took the other 3 of us, put us down on the beach, which we were right on the shore, on the beach in a sand cave dug for machine gun positions. It was big enough to put 2 Army cots in there, and we stayed there 3 months, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and we had 2 men to sleep at a time, and we had a field telephone, that was all. Again, waiting for something that never happened, but they didn't know. We'd have to go one at a time up to the main camp to eat, that sort of thing. And again, no showers. One day I took a chance, I took my clothes off and I jumped in the ocean. And with a bar of soap, it doesn't do anything. You can't get any louder or anything. And then a wave knocked me down and dragged me across some coral, and I was all cut up. And then I went to our corpsman because I was all these scrapes and things all over my body. He didn't know better, he put iodine on it.
Oh.
Not only hurt, but you don't put iodine, the iodine comes out of coral in the ocean.
That's great.
Does anybody have any questions? I kind of rambled on a little thing that I thought might be of interest to you.
Oh, there's the question.
Pardon?
Out here.
Right over here.
I'm sorry. Hey, yes, sir.
I'm just curious, the Torah, and other enactments of Pearl Harbor, did you happen to see those? And can you
Yeah, one of them, the first
comment
one
about
that
their
come out.
authenticity?
First one that came out, we were all invited to go for free down in Colorado Springs or Pueblo, I forget. Of course, a lot of the battle scenes, the ships, were probably military films worked into the show. They were pretty realistic, except for the love angles. They had Army nurses giving physicals to Navy pilots, things like that, or being in a place where they couldn't have been at that time. But other than that, it was a pretty good job.
Thank you.
George, have you been back to Hawaii at all?
Many times.
Many times?
When the Pearl Harbor Survivors organization was functional, we'd go back every so many years for memorials. And I've been over, took my kids over and everything. It's very moving for me to go to Arizona.
So how many of you are left?
Survivors? I have no idea because we dissolved the organization, we turned in our charter, we wouldn't get national officers anymore. We had 4 chapters here in Colorado originally. When I came, I visited all of them because I was a district officer. It's the same way with World War II vets. There were 15 million. The Legion magazine the other day estimated maybe 700,000 or 800,000 left, which sounds like a lot, but it's not many of 15 million.
I was curious on who was gonna get the bottle of whiskey.
I'll tell you a story about the bottle of whiskey. We had somebody give us, I don't know whether it's whiskey, but a bottle to be drunk when the last man's alive and all that. And the last national president we had was a teetotaler, and his wife was too. And they were the types that thought if you drank more than 2 drinks, you were an alcoholic. So they left it it's all wrapped up in a bag. Finally, he died, and his wife, I see her occasionally down in Havasu. She said, "What am I going to do with this?" I don't know, what do you do with it? I said, "The last guy alive will be in a nursing home and 97 years old, and he's not going to be able to drink it anyway." Well, I got it at home, and I don't know, you got any suggestions?
Sure, I'll help you.
I don't know what it is even.
Well, you know, probably water if they were teetotal.
Pardon?
It's probably full of water by now.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah. Probably not. Just kidding.
So George, did you stay at Brown Canyon the next 3 years?
Not next, well, I was there a total of 3.5 years. I came back on rotation finally. They were allowing 1 man to go at a time and went by seniority. And I came back, well, I stayed back here. I didn't rotate back again. They sent me to the infantry school, which I didn't really want to go, so I transferred back to the artillery. And at that time, well, actually, well, it's a long story. I actually went to OCS, but they were aiming mostly at anti-aircraft, that was their needs, but they'd overdone it. At Camp Davis in North Carolina, they had 2,000 second lieutenants waiting for assignment, so they didn't want any more. No, I came back and finally got back to Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is headquarters for Coast Artillery, and they sent me to a radar school, and I already had a radar MOS. And halfway through the course, I was called out by a major, and he said, "We're under pressure that any of our instructors that haven't been overseas to replace them with either overseas people or limited service. You gotta rotate. And you're a candidate, you wanna stay here as an instructor? I said, sure. So I spent the last almost a year as a radar instructor in Fort Monroe, Virginia. One thing I would like to mention, it's not part of my story so much, but something people don't think about, the Philippines. You know, the Philippines, Pearl Harbor got all the attention, but the Philippines went through the same thing on the same day. It was the 8th over there, not the 7th, but it was the same period. The Philippines had big coastal artillery bases, Corregidor, and there were troops on the mainland. I talked with a fellow, a casual friend of mine, who was there through the whole thing. They were 5 months under siege, and they gradually withdrew to Fort Corregidor. They ran out of food, they ran out of ammunition, they finally had, as a matter of fact, so much so, they had a cavalry unit still there from the old days. They ate their horses. But anyway, when they surrendered, they had the Bataan Death March, which you've heard of. They put on prison ships, which were horrible, to go to Japan, and then slave labor for 5 years. And people don't know much about the Philippines. If you have no other questions, that's about all I was going to talk about.
Question over here. What happened to the first sergeant's wife?
Well, I have to assume she was all right. She had a family in town. Although I knew when they rounded up Japanese in California, I didn't know what they did in Honolulu, because so many of the businesses and the craft people, those with some skills and things, were Japanese, and they were needed to run the businesses. But I just read recently an article about there was a small bunch of them that were rounded up and put in a camp on Oahu, just like they did in California, brought them here to Colorado. The other thing I might mention is they were worried about sabotage. The history tells us that the Japanese consul, they did no sabotage, but they were spying all the time. They would hire a taxi with a Japanese driver and drive up into the mountains above Pearl Harbor and report back to Japan on what ships were in there and when. And so the Japs knew Sunday was a down day for us, that we wouldn't be doing anything. But if you remember the history, our carriers, of which we only had 3, were out at sea that day. Otherwise, we'd have lost the carriers.
We lost the war.
Pardon?
We would have
Well,
lost the war.
We lost the war, yeah.
What did you do after your years in the service, George?
After I got out,
Yes.
well, I got out, if you remember the point system. I had a lot of points because I've been overseas so long and all that. And I got out and thought, I gotta look for a job. And radar had been very hush-hush up to that point. And I said, the airlines are gonna want radar. So I decided to go out to an airport and see what they could do. And I came out of a subway, and I lived in New York with my mother. I came up in Lower Manhattan. And right there on the corner was a Western Electric building. And some of the radars I worked on were built by Western Electric. So I went in there and talked to them. Well, you know, a warm body, the war was still going on. I got out after Germany surrendered. A warm body draft exempt, boy, they would grab you. You could have any job you wanted. And this place turned out to be doing installation work, and they were so far behind during the war. But fortunately, the gal, when she saw my record, she said, well, were you a technician in radar, or were you just an operator? No, I was a crew chief. She said, I'm going to send you up to see a Mr. Milmo, I remember this, and see if he'll want you to work for them. It's Bell Telephone Laboratories. If they don't take you, you come right back here, you've got a job. Well, I went up to see Mr. Milmo, and they hired me. And they said, you're gonna be a temporary employee, because I had to take jobs. I had a wife and 2 kids by this time. I needed to work. You're a temporary employee, because as our GIs come back, we've got to give them their jobs back. So 37 years later, as a temporary employee, I retired. But it was research and development, and I started in the research. I went to college on the GI Bill also, and it was good.
What brought you to Colorado?
The company,
The company did?
I went to work for them in New York City. When I took the job, they said, you know, if you take this job, you're gonna have to move out. We've got a new building going up in New Jersey. And I thought, thank God, I didn't want to stay in New York anyway. And then, that was the research department. Then after a while, I got out of research, and if you didn't have a PhD, researchers, you're a flunky for somebody else. I was an engineer. And I transferred to development, which I like. It's more of a hands-on kind of thing. And the development department had a new building built in South Jersey, so we moved there. At that time, there was a rumor that they were gonna send some department to Illinois, and I asked about it. They said, no, we don't know who's going yet, but it wouldn't be us. 6 months later, I was on my way to Illinois. And then, in Illinois, they were gonna expand again, put a place out, and it was either Colorado, Portland, Oregon, somewhere in California. When they announced it, we were sent to Colorado, which was great, the best move made.
Cool.
It worked out. So my army benefited my career, my employment. Anything else, or?
I would like to comment that George was also a phenomenally reliable ambulance person. Phenomenally reliable ambulance person.
Oh, thank you. Well, when I came here, I wanted to do something to keep occupied in retirement, and I tried to find things like joining organizations and stuff. And the way they worked the ambulance at that time, we were all volunteers. It was not like it is now. And you put on the sheet every week how much time you had, what days you wanted to be on call. Well, I averaged 100 hours a week on call, not working that much. But I had the time and I enjoyed it. I'd also been back in New Jersey, we used to have rescue squads with the volunteer ambulance crews. I'd had some experience. I thank you very much for your attention.